Fantastic. You guys ready to go?
Yeah, I think so.
Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Well, welcome to everyone zooming in for our panel discussion on hope, creativity, and the environment. My name is Todd DuBose, and I'm from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. And I'll be offering a post-pandemic phenomenology of hope, itself being infected with me by the crisis of COVID-19, while my colleagues will demonstrate transformative responses to this crisis. Tomo Imamichi from the City University of New York and LaGuardia Community College here in the US will address creativity in crisis and what happens when the taken for granted and the familiar are taken from us. Jennifer Adler, also from the City University of New York and from the borough of Manhattan College, Community College, will then take us on a visit through our pandemic village as she brings concerns as an environmental psychologist in these times, including alterations of our situational designs, increased surveillance, displacement, and or gentrification, and our management of these challenges. Our intent is to each of us to present for about 20 minutes and then invite 10 minutes of questions or dialogue. And if we have afforded time at the end of our presentations, all the better for more dialogue. Hope in our everydayness takes the form of either wishes or futurial projections, or is viewed as childish but soothing analgesia to existential horror, or even as a conversation piece among mundane preferences in a privileged world, such as, I hope the mangoes are on sale this weekend. It's nice, but not practical and relegated to the realm of dreams and prayers. Yet therapeutes are agents of hope, and therapeutes we are, no matter what form our service may be, counselor, teacher, parent, or friend. And yet in a crisis, the hope we offer seems often to be little more than cheerleading in a volley with despair and losing more often than not. Nevertheless, we hope with each breath and each waking eye, even within our despair, a point I'll return to later. We are unaware of this lived ontological event of hope until our everyday understanding of hope has been shattered by crisis. Crisis distinguishes, separates, differentiates, which in this situation is a differentiation of what we hoped hope to be from what it is. I keep the Greek word krisis rather than crisis in this discussion, as krisis better retains the notion of resolute undecidability, which I will argue is hope when scrubbed by krisis. Undecidability, as I'm using it here, is as described in continental philosophy by the late Jacques Derrida, and more currently in John Caputo's work, as an event that is both possible and impossible at the same time, and yet an event that nonetheless calls for decisiveness. The undecidability is both the impossible hard no of the incurable, irreversible, inconceivable, and unmitigated, but also the inescapable hell yes of the irreducible and the unconditional. Crisis dismembers and reconfigures horizons of expectations and dependencies on having, knowing, expecting, concluding, and producing. A crisis is often initially experienced as a betrayal by life as planned, resulting in a vivid experience of the impotence of the should, drenched in a jarring cold shower of ontological insecurity. It was once noted by the existential philosopher Will Barrett that we don't know what agency and choice are until we're confronted by a life and death situation. So it is with hope. When living through having COVID-19 myself, I vividly remember the night when I wasn't sure whether to go to bed and risk not breathing again, or go to the ER and risk being put on a ventilator. We all were instructed to go to the hospital if we couldn't breathe, but I could breathe, at least barely. And I didn't want to take a bed from somebody else if I could avoid it, let alone my fear that if I go in, I wouldn't come out. I stood in the hallway with my partner, herself infected with COVID-19, both of us dramatically unsure of what to do. My dry cough had gotten bad enough that it felt as though I was breathing hot cotton. Terrified that my airway was closing, my partner held my hand and kept reciting, "You are breathing, keep breathing." Our French bulldog, the bravest companion throughout this experience, shored up next to me. "Keep breathing," I told myself. I have sleep apnea, and so I sleep with a CPAP machine. I think it very well could have kept me alive. My mantra, dum spiro spero. While I breathe, I hope. But I still hope that I could breathe. Undecidability surrounded and infused these moments. Any symptom could be recontextualized to mean something else. We were and are continually offered contradictory information by experts disclosing the politics of statistics, which merely showed us the fact that there is no raw empiricism. Each day, press conferences are held by those who knowingly tell us that they know and don't know what COVID-19 really is, how long it's going to last, what symptoms counted that particular day, and then prescribe us hope as whistling in the dark 6 to 8 feet from each other while we wait on an antidote or vaccine that has yet to come. Hope became 6 to 8 feet from each other, bolstered by the talisman of a mask. I realized, though, that hope itself had been infected by COVID-19 as it is by any other crisis and had been intubated. Thankfully, Dr. Anthony Fauci brought a strange sense of comfort to me when he said that after 50 years of studying infectious diseases, he didn't know why an elderly person survived COVID-19 while someone healthy in his 30s died within 12 hours from a blood clot. When knowers don't know and own it, I, paradoxically, didn't feel so alienated. I should have felt more hopeless, but knowing the greatest minds around the world were on it, and the greatest hearts were working nonstop intense, caring for those infected by it, even when bewildered and unproductive, the experience brought, strangely, hope. And this is the undecidability. The possibility shows up when faced with the impossible. Unknowing can damn, but also bond us in our vulnerability. Our social distancing alienates and protects. I haven't hugged my adult children in nearly 3 months now, yet I am inspired at the camaraderie of us all being in this together. Distance protects our lungs, yet alienates our embodied souls. Crisis throws us into a hermeneutical vertigo where the truth is revealed that there is no absolute, static, and stable truth. It is both and, either or, this and that, appearance and illusion, a trickster, shape-shifting at any moment. This is crisis, but crisis also calls forth a response nevertheless, as undecidability is not indecidability, but a call to act in spite of our hermeneutical vertigo. And to highlight the most paradoxical aspect of finitude of all, existentially, ontologically, we can't not act. Crisis kills hope, defined as confident projections of future gratification, unfettered by contingencies. The loved ones of 100,000 people here in the US alone surely hoped for an outcome other than the cruel one handed them. This is when people stop hoping and praying, if they ever did. And for those who don't, existence thickens with even more mundaneness of fatalistic whatever. Crisis takes away our heretofore assuredness, potency, and confidence that everything is going to be all right, that things will work out in the end, that there is a reason for everything. Is despair all that we're left with the rummage after crisis? And should we despair about such despair? Despair is the mournful recognition, a disappointment and loss of what we hoped hope would be. Despair is not a private.
I think we lost James or Todd. That's really unfortunate. Mm. Let's give him a minute. So that's really unfortunate. He doesn't seem to be connecting right away again. Do either of you want to jump in and do your presentation first and then we come back to Todd? Would that be all right? I mean, there's not much we can do at the moment.
Tomo, do you want to? Because I know you were supposed to be next.
Right. Should we give him just for a few more minutes, perhaps?
Sure.
Any questions?
Any questions so far?
And perhaps we can let the rest of the people know.
This is a crisis and a crisis.
Yeah, I was actually also worried that this would happen to my presentation as well. I wonder whether Todd knows that he's disconnected.
Oh, wait. Someone just popped in. I see two of him now. Oh, your mic's off.
You're muted.
I'm sorry, my internet dropped from my end for some reason. I'm back on. Can people hear me?
Yep.
Okay. If y'all don't mind, I'm gonna try to take my question time just to finish up.
We'll still have a lot of time. So.
Okay. Let me just pick back up where I was. The endurance called for in surviving COVID-19 and the unpredictable attacks from any direction that could occur can take you to the edge and call for surrender. There's so much focus on survival that this symptom is often overlooked. One feels the undertow of surrender while patterns of suffering are unmitigatable. When endurance has no finish line, when one's pain overrides any felt love or concern for those, if any, in one's life, and when the cost analysis of continued biological existence pays out nothing but continued suffering, a kind of COVID ennui or Weltschmerz settles in, a weariness, being fed up and having had it with the interminable illness, how it has been handled, the aimless guidance, the politics of masks, the selfish noncompliance, the annoyance of the same old, and confinement. Suicide crosses many a mind and heart as it would save a bed and end the entrapment. But it usually is kept to oneself so as not to be put in another kind of bed and entrapped even more. But there is a counter feeling that suicide wouldn't satisfy what needs addressing, even personally, and even though no one is quite clear what that may be. This is when despair becomes undecidable and an expected Trojan horse of hope. The tragic irony is that even suicide is an act of hope, whether it occurred at Masada or when jumpers leaped hand in hand out of the trade towers at 9/11, or simply someone who wants to end their suffering before being ended by it. But this moment discloses the essence of hope, not its end. We are hoping when we host hopelessness, Even more precisely, hope is being when there is no thing. We learned from Auschwitz that theology begins with atheism, and a prayer becomes a prayer only when we no longer know what and to whom to pray. The poet Wendell Berry put it succinctly: when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And when we no longer know which way to go, we have begun our real journey. Such is the experience of undecidability, and so it is with post-pandemic hope. Crisis brings us to hope, not away from it. Hope is not a calculation of deferred gratification, but an immediacy. Crisis-born hope is not a prostalgia or pain for what one wishes life could be, but an in spite of in the eternal now. Each moment opens to what Alfred North Whitehead called the novel occasion of the next moment, in which, I say in turn, one finds oneself having hoped, which propels the next moment. Even when the next occasion is resignation, one hopes in the turning away, in the giving in of what might be other than what has been. In short, hope in post-pandemic times or post-crisis is the inescapable, pre-reflective decisiveness in undecidability. Viktor Frankl, the well-known Holocaust survivor and founder of logotherapy, would ask persons who were suicidal, "Why are you still alive?" The question was not a reprimand for not getting on with it, but a call for attention to the fact that one was still living for some reason. Hope is inescapable if understood as enactments nevertheless. The evidence of hope is in what we are doing when we can't be evidence-based, what we are doing when we have neither conclusions nor measurements, and what we are doing when our raison d'etre is fogged. Hope is our gasp when breath is short. Long before we know we are doing it, we are always and already living into what the continental philosopher of religion, John Caputo, calls what might be, perhaps. We are not looking at what might be, but living a perhaps. We don't have to find, muster, or create hope. We are hope. In that dark night, wondering whether my breaths were numbered, I began to realize what monks and sages from multiple traditions have offered to us for eons. It is not I who breathed, but I was being breathed. My agency was and is in response to what is out of my hands. Taken up by the other can be comforting and terrifying. Where this may bring ontological insecurity during a crisis, that there is something more than us that has us, it can also be a recognition that hope, like breath, like pneuma, prana, ruach, is ontological. The evidence of hope is boundless. Albert Camus' The Plague, which many of us have revisited during this time, ends with the narrator revealing himself and concluding that there are more things to admire in human beings than to despise. What is central to this message in The Plague are the choices of heroism and care that are expenditures without expectation of return, a staying, helping, giving, and sacrificing without knowledge of the future, or a bleak one, if any. We are flooded as much by this kind of love during these times as we are horror. It is in the direction in which Fred Rogers pointed us when we asked him what to tell the children about crisis. He said, "Tell them, watch all the people who are helping." How could we not help? How could we not meet each other, even at 6 to 8 feet apart or in pixels? We are breathed, and hope is itself pandemic. Thank you. Now, I think if there are any questions, if there are no thoughts or questions, we can proceed. Okay. Tomo?
Yeah, perhaps you can give it a few more minutes for people to have some questions or comments.
I'm looking to see if anything is coming up in the chats.
I believe there are a few comments in the Q&A. One, Stacy Griffin says, I believe we're all left speechless. Thank you. Rohit says, thank you, Dr. DuBose. And then Jay Handler is asking, when you say crisis, is it spelled like crisis?
Right. Right. Thank you. Great. I think we ought to move on then. Maybe we'll have some discussion at the end, perhaps.
You want to respond to the crises and crisis?
Yeah, I'm typing some answers in. In terms of the crisis, the spelling is Krisis, and from the Greek words. Okay. Okay, Tom, I think we're ready. Tomo, you can proceed if you'd like. I think you got to unmute yourself.
Okay, great. Bonsoir, Paris, and good afternoon, America, and Ohayou gozaimasu, Japan. And of course, hello to everybody who is joining us from somewhere else. I'm going to talk a little bit about creativity in crisis, and I also have a little presentation, so perhaps I can do, oh yes, I can do the screen share. So first I will start out with the, it's my slides. So, oops, I should go to the beginning, would be better. Okay, so creativity in crisis. Crisis, pretty much danger and opportunity. In Japanese, it is written with the Chinese characters, kiki, which is composed of ki associated with danger, and the other ki is associated with opportunity. And hence we have some form of possibilities for transformation. But then again, transformation into what? And first I would like to talk a little bit about some of the dangers, which are more amplification and consolidation of powers and so-called opportunities for private-public partnerships, which oftentimes lead to an amplification of social environmental injustices. I'm also thinking about more surveillance, more discipline. So there's also an association possibly with Foucault into an ever more technocratic dystopia. Few thoughts about the ever more technocratic dystopia.
Sorry, Tomo?
Yes?
We still see your last slide. Did you put the presentation in full screen? Because we still see your slide in the browser.
Oh, so you don't even see, okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
Wondering.
So it would be best if you close the screen share again, start
Okay.
up the presentation, and then choose the window where the presentation is already in full screen.
Okay, so, and then I go back to screen share.
Yes.
Okay. And this one. Okay, sorry about that.
Now we see it. Perfect.
Right. So into an ever more technocratic dystopia. So I will refer to my multiple identities. One as a concerned citizen. We feel ever more remote controlled, and also in a ever more computer internet dependency, including some form of technological vulnerability, which might be also the next virus, a computer virus. And then of course, also the concern of the loss of a public space, which are, I think, also conditions for democracy. Then also there are concerns about as a worker and an educator. When we have remote working, distance learning, and then of course, there might be some technological integration, but at the same time, some form of existential alienation and disconnection. And then as an academic, I'm also thinking about new issues that pertain to computer and internet privilege, which has multiple components. One is, of course, that pertains to skills and knowledge and access, which of course then also goes back to, who has the better computer and the better internet access too. And then at the same time, also privileging the mediated over the direct, the virtual over the physical, and some of the implications that it might have on being and doing. And then also as an environmental psychologist, I'm also wondering about the ever more perceived obsolescence of physical space and in-person interaction. And then of course, depending in what field people are in, obviously there are those physical spaces such as the studio, the lab, the classroom, the field, and then of course, we can talk about hands-on, the experiential, and the so-called accidental, which are all, I think, conditions for creativity. And then, of course, is there any good that can come out of this? And here, I think we can talk about opportunities. One, of course, is the ecological relief. We can think about how this, in several ways, is actually quite beneficial for the environment. And some of those measures should have been possibly taken a long time ago, maybe in slightly, of course, different ways. And there is, of course, more time at home. And if you're privileged, of course, an opportunity to spend more time in the basement and also perhaps in the woods, if you have access to that. But I think it's also important that you can also draw on those past urban experiences that we are now sort of deprived of. Because yes, perhaps the basement and the woods are great places to kind of, think about things, but they only become meaningful if there are some past experiences that you can kind of like draw from, that you can then reflect upon. And then of course, we all have these calls for creativity in different ways, such as creative adjustments, whether, on all different levels. And on that note, I should perhaps also say that, well, creative adjustment to what? Is it to the new normal, but within the same old status quo? But of course, creative adjustments is one thing. We can also talk about creative resistance and creative transformations. And then I forgot to thank the organizers, of course. We have the Psychology of Global Crisis virtual conference, which I'm quite amazed how everything was put together so quickly and so timely. And I want to specifically point out to some of the calls for the presentations, which basically, this allows us to handle a variety of contribution, highlighting the variety part, and we actively encourage creative and experimental formats, also here highlighting the creative and the experimental formats. And then I was wondering, perhaps you ask for this, and basically coming sort of like to the main part of this presentation, which will be a select series of short videos made in this transition to distance learning for different psychology classes. So right now I'm teaching a general psychology class, and social psychology class, as well as an environmental psychology class. And in all this transition, of course, college told us it is very important to maintain presence. So in a way, to be there without really being there, and in a way to have this presence beyond the classroom, because obviously the classroom in its traditional format no longer exists. So here we have some form of adjustment that was taking place. And then we have the other part, to practice, and pardon my German, I'm going to say üben and ausüben. One, of course, practice, I want to play on the practice in terms of learning and training, and then ausüben in terms of actually applying something. So basically to practice in both senses something else from an ordinary class, and in a way also possibly becoming someone else. And here I think this is where we have something that might be some form of transformation. So perhaps I can share a few videos. They're all short videos, and let me maybe go back to the screen, and then hopefully this will work. Okay, so I'm going to then try to share the, just have to find, maybe I should just click on that link again, sorry about that. Okay, so.
Feeling okay? Many people keep asking me if I'm feeling okay. Is there something that makes them think that I'm not feeling okay? Or is it okay to feel okay, considering the social and environmental issues in this world? I have been spending much time in the basement, talking to myself, to the computer, making videos that hardly anybody watches. But we are all trying to adjust to remote working, distance learning. Are we trying to adjust, or should we transform ourselves? To transform ourselves may require spending time in the basement and talking to ourselves. Hearing and seeing oneself talk on video can be quite insightful and therapeutic. And there's nothing to worry about if nobody sees it. Spending much time
Tomo, we can't
Yeah.
see the
being
video.
online,
Oh, really?
Yes. Oh, we're still looking at your
tied to
PowerPoint.
the screen,
Oh, sorry about that.
caught in the
Um,
web. Always connect.
So let me just try to work this out.
We could hear you, but we couldn't see you.
Okay. So, oh, I'm still in the PowerPoint. Okay, so maybe I should close that one. Does this work now?
Now we see you.
Yeah, now we
Okay,
can
great.
see.
Sorry about that. And thanks for letting me know.
It, but out of touch, always informed, but never know much. Stressed in the virtual world, digital overload. Together, together, together alone. Together alone, with laptop and phone, wasting away, day after day, tied to the screen, caught in the web, always a presence, but never quite there. Always informed, but never quite care. Stressed in the virtual world, digital overload. Together, together, together alone. Together alone. With laptop and phone, together, together, together. もしもし。はい。Personality traits may indicate how people will respond to a given situation. Let's take a crisis situation, perhaps a pandemic, and try to apply the 5-factor model, which has 5 factors. The openness dimension, people who might be higher on the openness dimension might be more easily adapting to the newness and change. However, they might be also prone to more risk-taking behaviors. Conscientiousness, people who are high on the conscientiousness dimension associated with self-control and discipline are more likely to stick to that hand washing and cleaning, hence might help slow the spread. Perhaps also engaging in social distancing too, which might be hard for people higher on the extroversion dimension who thrive on contact with people and stimulation, which actually might be a blessing in disguise for those who are more on the introversion side. Agreeableness. People who are high on agreeableness tend to be more trusting and cooperating with neighbors, community, and possibly authorities, whereas people who are lower on the agreeableness dimension might be a little bit more suspicious. And did anybody say conspiracy? Neuroticism. Neuroticism might be putting people at higher risk for anxiety and depression. Although having said that, of course, any given situation, particularly a crisis, pandemic, can be rather stressful. However, when it comes to stress, There are plenty of other videos to watch. Are you feeling stressed? Perhaps you can try the two-factor theory. Perhaps you can try meaning-making coping. Perhaps you can try restorative environments. Perhaps you can try bubble wrap popping. Mono no aware, the pathos of things, the aesthetic of impermanence, epitomized by falling flowers. Up until 3 days ago, the sun was shining and the flowers were in full bloom. But now, they're blown by the wind and battered by the rain. But there is some beauty in this. Welcome to a conversation between a YouTuber and an academic. In this conversation, we will be discussing the presenting of psychological material. For a YouTuber, it is a challenge how to condense seemingly complex concepts into 2 minutes, the average attention span. In the context of academia, it is very much about expanding seemingly simple ideas into 2-hour lectures or 20-page papers. And I'm not saying that just to fill the length of a lecture or an article. Of course, the challenge is how to capture and captivate the audience and deliver some content. Fortunately, I have a captive audience and I'm not primarily doing this for entertainment but for educational purposes and provide some depth and details. To meaningfully discuss something may require consideration of historical, social-cultural, and environmental factors, as well as an evaluation of empirical evidence of relevance. But then again, I might lose my audience sometimes. Highlighting some particularly interesting, relatable, and applicable aspects are of particular importance. Something that may get people interested and engaged. Supplemental materials, such as videos, are of course a way to enrich the content. I hope you enjoyed this little conversation and join us in the near future for a conversation between a Japanese and a German.
Okay, so these were the series of select videos that I wanted to share. Each of them, in a way, I did share with respective classes and try to give them a little bit of, again, a presence, and at the same time also using this opportunity to maybe show them a different side, perhaps, of different materials. Obviously, there's a lot of things that wouldn't be possible in a classroom context, but now once you kind of being somewhere else, you can be present in a different way. So these were some of the select videos, and pretty much that would pretty much conclude the presentation part. And perhaps there are some questions that you might have that I'll be happy to address.
Tomo, I just appreciated the playfulness, that the being elsewhere so that we could be more playful it gives us more expansiveness to that. And I don't know if you intentionally had that in mind or just when you started doing this, if it just unnaturally unfolded.
Right. So what was also, of course, quite interesting about this particular situation, where basically also people are calling to, you just have to be creative, and of course there are different ways to interpret that part. Yeah, I don't think that I would have done those videos without being put in that sort of situation. And then occasionally, of course, you get carried away a little bit. And then at the same time, there's a way to kind of excuse yourself, because given those circumstances, I think there might be also a little bit more of some forgiveness to all this.
I do have to endorse Tomo. He does have a YouTube channel. So if you're hungry for more, you could see a whole collection of his wonderful and whimsical videos about teaching from the basement.
Right. And of course, all of that is still somewhat of a work in progress, right? So hopefully, yes, it comes more. And I think I have a question from Nicholas. Hello, Nicholas. Great snippets. What was the purpose to introduce creative resistance and transformation, right? Have your students followed up a similar and wonderful creations? Oh, and yes, that is actually a very good question. And particularly, when I was creating this presentation, I did want to acknowledge this importance of not just, adjusting to the situation, because I think adjusting is one thing, but, I think also the idea of resisting is very important, and of course, transformation as well. And unfortunately, I myself haven't quite found a way to process everything yet. And so what might be ways to creatively resist, some of the impending possible dangers that are coming up, and what are different ways to transform ourselves. And that is definitely something that I probably need to discuss more with my students, and also kind of like encourage them to do so. So thank you, Nicholas. Oh, and then from Ernst. Hello, Ernst. Yes, and actually I also enjoyed your talk, Ernst, as well, when you talked about sort of like technology that can be used in sort of like different ways. And yes, that there are a lot of possibilities with new technologies, yet at the same time, there are also a lot of the things that we might be losing. And I think this is definitely the concerns, about sort of like this, the physical spaces, and then of course that in-person interaction, and particularly something that pertains to, as I also mentioned, like the conditions of creativity, because yes, we can be also creative online, but I think a lot of the creativity probably also takes place offline, right? Principle for creative online teaching. Right, and this is actually also that I'm trying to begin to, in a way, discover, because obviously, if you're not really forced to engage with certain technologies, I don't think that me personally, I would have engaged with that. But now that I feel more and more pressure to do so, these are, of course, things to consider. And again, not just kind of like doing the same thing online, but maybe trying to do, because we're doing things online, how we might have to do them slightly differently. And then, of course, my hope is still that we don't end up, because when they say everything temporary may become permanent, and of course this is of course also a great risk, so that we don't necessarily, that this whole thing doesn't shift to something that the temporality becomes a permanence in that sense. Great. So thank you for watching, and of course also for the great questions, and of course particularly inspiring questions, because these are of course things that I have to take and really digest, because as I also was watching the videos myself, I was like, okay, I might not be necessarily making full use of all those things that could have been made use of, but again, I see this whole thing as a work in progress, so going back to practice, right? So it's something that is part of the training and learning process, and at the same time, of course, some of trying to execute something as well. Oh, thank you. There was another comment. The guitar song makes me sad, but makes me feel I'm not alone. Yes, that's actually, I like this comment very much, because oftentimes, when people are trying to cheer people up and people are sort of like trying to be positive about things, I think there's also something great to say about something that might actually evoke some form of like sadness, perhaps, because this sort of like shared sadness is perhaps a way in which we might actually not feel so alone. And I think it's also important to embrace potentially, of course, sadness to some extent. So thank you very much for that comment. And are we allowed to? Thank you, Niklas, for that comment. Yes, I am trying to get to 1 million views, and I'm about what 999,000 short. So yes, so please do share it, and maybe I can make another career out of this. And yes, I have been working on other videos, and the conversation between the Japanese and the German is also upcoming. So if you can watch out on that, yes.
Well, any other questions or comments for Tomo? Okay, shall we shift to Jennifer?
Yeah, but I don't know how I'm going to follow that, Tomo. I know I've seen some of them before. Oh, wait. I think we just got one other thing. Maybe you could share a link in Slack, or if you give me a link to it, I could do that for you, Tomo. I think that's from Tim.
Oh, great. Yes. Thank you, Tim. I haven't done Slack much yet, so maybe I should start doing that, but maybe I can actually also put some link on the Q&A thing.
Okay. Am I up?
Just real quick to that, I'm not sure you can put things in the Q&A as a panelist, but you could just write in the chat the link and I can give it to all the attendees. I can write it to all the attendees so everyone can just then copy the link and they all have it then.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Jennifer.
Oh, please. It's okay. So without further ado, I guess I'm going, and I think it's interesting, A, to be participating in my first virtual conference, but B, to follow these two esteemed researchers. There's an interesting lineage, certainly, between the two presentations that have come before me. One, in that the first one was very much embodied, very much in the person. Tomo's was very much in his home, in his basement. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit now to discuss the world outside the home. So when we're talking about crisis, we could talk about it obviously on many levels. You know, as many of you know, we have a clinician in the house today, and we have two environmental psychologists, or as Tomo would say, critical environmental psychologists. So what I'm going to try to do is present some photographs that I've been taking in Greenwich Village, where I've not only lived for many years in a very, very small apartment, but I also did quite a bit of research in with displaced groups about 15 years ago. And I did start this project sort of as a way to answer my many friends who are out of town who hear about New York City on the news in the context of COVID-19, in the context of coronavirus. And they have very interesting and diverse views about what it is to live, in many cases, ground zero for the American outbreak. So I started just loosely taking pictures around the neighborhood with my very old cell phone. And when this came up, it was suggested that maybe I start sharing them a little bit broader. And I'd be exceedingly curious to hear how many of these images are similar to your own experiences and also quite different, as I'm sure many of you have. And you live in different locales, different density of population, different epidemiological realities in terms of this virus. But certainly, please let me know. And like Tomo and Dr. DuBose, certainly, this is very much a personal project. I am a woman living in a particular neighborhood. And all of you, if you lived in this neighborhood, you may have different experiences, but I'll briefly talk about the history of the area and why it's important, and also sort of the reality of living there. And if anyone even has questions while we're going along, if you put it in the chat or in the Q&A, I will certainly try to address it. I will get a little into ecological theory as well to talk about how our lived experience in the public also has the potential to affect mental health, because I think that's a very interesting thing to consider. As some of you may know, I love the conception of it's not just what's inside your head, it's what your head's inside of. So when we start talking about the relationship to mental health and well-being to the world around us, it's a very, very much a nuanced one. So let me see if I could get my slides up, and please let me know if there are any technical glitches, which I'm sure there will be. So let's see, let me screen share. Okay, can everyone see that all right? Anyone having issues? Oh, I see a thumbs up, thank you. I really appreciate that. Okay, so again, the vast majority of these photos have been taken in the neighborhood I live in, the neighborhood I've done research in for many years, and it's also certainly walking distance from Borough Manhattan Community College, which is part of the public City University of New York system that is quite diverse. Overwhelmingly have students of color and are low income, but the transformation of this neighborhood has been well documented, certainly over the years, in terms of its importance, related not only to the arts movements, but also to historic preservation, and as well to certainly the history of this country as a whole. So this first slide here, oops, and hold on one second, I'm just gonna make it a little bit smaller because I see I have a chat note here. Oh, that's from Tomo, okay, thank you for that. So this first slide is of the Jefferson Market Library, okay, it's on 6th Avenue, and I will put it this way. And also it has a very long and storied history. I could share a lot more of it, certainly later on. It was originally a courthouse, it's now a public library. It at one point had a jail where everyone from Mae West to the murder of Stanford White was arraigned or imprisoned there. But this photo was taken yesterday. I think one of the really noted things about New York City, if you are not familiar, is the population density. And we'll talk about how that's changed. So this issue of proxemics certainly is a very important one. Okay, so this slide here to the left, that's the exact same library I just took a picture of, only it's 1935. So when people start thinking of Greenwich Village, they certainly may think about the gangs in New York. They may think about the longshoremen and the outsiders who lived there, certainly in the 1700s and the early 1800s. More likely, they would think about the Beat movement. They'd think about Bohemianism. They'd think about the birth of the LGBT community in terms of their political mobilization. To the right are some slides I took in 2004 for a project I did with the redevelopment of Hudson River Park, which was a massive public-private works that essentially redeveloped the whole west side of Manhattan. And I'll show you a map next that talks a little bit about where that is. And it's interesting for a number of reasons. And one that has to do with who has ownership of the area. The Far West Village, certainly for the last 50 years, if not more, had been associated with homeless LGBT teens. And many of them were displaced during the redevelopment of the West Side. So certainly 15 years ago, there were massive protests about certainly redeveloping that park, closing a lot of drop-in and healthcare delivery services, and certainly sex work played a part of this as well. In recent years, the area has been profoundly gentrified. It's one of the most expensive areas of New York. And just briefly talk about it a little more. The term Greenwich Village comes from the Dutch, sorry about that. I'm just moving you guys out of the way so I could see my slides a little bit better. Comes from the Dutch Green District. It's historically linked to outsiders, bohemianism, the arts, LGBT advocacy. It's the home of the Stonewall riots, and I'll certainly show you some things that are very, very close to where they occurred. It has a long history of experience and crisis. It has the HIV/AIDS epidemic, certainly in the late 80s. St. Vincent's Hospital, which is now luxury condos like so much, was one of the major places that gave delivery to some of the earliest HIV patients, and the HIV/AIDS memorial is right across the street from that location, and 9/11. So if you see on the left, Greenwich Village, the West Village, typically is assumed to be south of 14th Street, and this is Manhattan. The Empire State Building, Times Square, all of those things are quite a bit north of the area I'm talking about. We're on the west side. But certainly after 9/11, usually the crisis zone was considered south of 14th Street, where this area solidly is. So many people found soot and burning embers in their homes, even though they were quite a bit further north of the area. And for claims to, registration for healthcare services going forward, victims' compensation funds, HEPA filtration, distribution, usually the cutoff was 14th Street. So certainly there is a lot going on here as it relates to, let me go back, as it relates to the history of crisis in this area. And give me 1 second, unfortunately, Zoom is putting, okay, that should be better. Zoom is blocking my slides. Give me 1 second, and well, let me go back to it. Okay, so, profound path to gentrification. There's been commercialization, and more recently, significant high rent and retail blight. Bleecker Street, which was one of the main thoroughfares in the area, is often referred to as Bleecker, B-L-E-A-K-E-R, because of the profound number of vacancies in the area. And one of the things that's, if you're not familiar to what's going on in New York during this area, it's that we are in pause. That's what the governor's called it. It's a 10-point plan for shutting down the city. Anything that isn't essential business is completely and utterly shut down. Okay. I want to just talk about some really unique things about this area. And that is how we consider the impact of coronavirus and other public health phenomena on this particular area and others. The New York Times made use of micromort language, and if you missed the article, they say, converting this to micromort language, an individual living in New York City has experienced roughly 50 additional micromorts of risk per day because of COVID-19, and that is all of New York City, including Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island, and Queens, of course. This means you were roughly twice as likely to die as you would have been if you were serving in the US Armed Forces in Afghanistan throughout 2010, a particularly deadly year. So again, how we frame the scope of the impact really depends on sort of not only statistical interpretation, but also representation. The micromort language is one interesting one. However, the village, and the West Village in particular, has been impacted far less than many other areas. Another New York Times article published in the last few weeks, roughly 5% of residents, or about 420,000 people, left the city between March 1st and May 1st. In the city's very wealthiest blocks and neighborhoods like the Upper East Side, the West Village, Soho, and Brooklyn Heights, the residential population decreased by 40% or more, while the rest of the city saw comparably modest changes. So on the left, this is data representation also from the New York Times that shows the drop-off of population based on income percentile. I've seen estimates that the West Village in particular have drop-offs of populations somewhere between 40 to 60% compared to where they were prior to this crisis. And I think that's a very interesting thing to consider when we're talking about the socioeconomic ramifications of all of this, okay? Changes. Certainly, there is this issue of surveillance, and with a nod to Elvis Costello, I think of being a detective, watching the detectives. Jane Jacobs certainly talked about safety and advocated much of her activism about saving Greenwich Village. And she talked about the eyes on the street and how there's safety in an active and vibrant community. Not only has the population dropped off, very few people are going out of their homes. When they do, they're usually younger, they're usually drinking, and everything pretty much shuts down at 8 p.m. So even businesses that are traditionally open 24 hours, like pharmacies, will close down significantly sooner. So in terms of this issue of observation and being observed, we as residents or people in the community are observing the physical changes to our neighborhoods. We're observing the physical changes to ourselves. How do I feel? Is my throat a little bit scratchy? Uh-oh, do I have coronavirus? Is it safe for me to go out? We're observing people around us. Are they wearing masks? Are they wearing gloves? Are they getting too close? Don't stand too close to me, that's danger, okay? We're watching the news. Certainly, beyond this, we are being watched. We have the galvanizing of surveillance technology, cameras, cell-enabled geolocation, temperature checks, which are actually being performed at a number of businesses in the area. There's a sushi restaurant on 6th Avenue that requires a temperature check for any delivery people to come in before they pick up food. Drones, which have been experimentally used in a number of areas in New York to look for people getting too close to one another. And also the erosion of medical privacy. So when we talk about things like HIPAA and how that relates to the sharing of information with public health authorities, we have the hiring of contact tracers, okay? And there's some debate certainly about what their role is at this point. Are they valuable public health tools or professional snitches? Certainly their job is to locate people in space and then report back in the hopes of decreasing a further outbreak. You're too close, you're at risk. So certainly there are a lot of issues, and I could talk about my own lived experience, and that I always feel very safe in the city. I work all the way uptown, I work all the way downtown, but certainly there are some significant changes. And of course, this is a musician on the street a few days ago telling people to stay far away, pay him digitally, because cashless is safer, and wearing his mask, as he should. Although, as some people think, they should not, because it's totalitarian. I think it's important to consider that these changes are very much multisensorial in that they affect the sounds of the city. It is unbelievably quiet. We don't hear planes, we don't hear ambulances, we don't hear traffic. There's so many things about that lived experience that are tactile and olfactory. Restaurants are closed. You don't smell bakeries anymore. There are many things like that. But they're multidimensional and they're likely impermanent. So these changes are being implemented, certainly, and then likely will have to change again when our public health crisis changes. So some things worth noting in the neighborhood. Certainly there's a Consolidation of art is a morale booster. This is one such project where positive messages have been put all over Greenwich Village. Tough times don't last, tough people do. Stay positive, stay strong. Positive affirmations, they're messages of gratitude, lots of things. Thank you, heroes. Thank you, healthcare workers. Thank you, neighbors. There are many collaborative creations where we're asking people in the community to contribute to projects, and quite a bit of child-produced positivity, such as there's one place where children are contributing rainbows to be put on in a mural, okay, to raise people's spirits. But of course, art is a reflection of the times, and there's quite a bit of dark humor and art that is evocative of plagues past. We see quite a bit of mobilization of sometimes dark humor, lots of adding masks to statues and mannequins and monuments and other pre-existing art pieces. You'll see the dog in the window of the pet portraiture shop now has a proper face mask on. Barber shops, we see representations of plague doctors. So there are many different ways to approach this, and humor certainly is one, okay? But one of the things that is quite striking is how the environments have become more increasingly assertive. And these are all signs from the village, mostly the West Village. Some are a little bit into the East Village, but signs and signals suggest where should we stand, where should we go, what should we wear, how to act, when to act, how long we should act. For example, a local drugstore says, please shop quickly to limit your time in public, okay? And certainly if we consider shopping as an activity, this is very different. We see arrows, we have footprints on the ground where to place our feet, and we keep hearing, play it smart, 6 feet apart, which is certainly very different when you're living in such a densely populated area. We also have to navigate new ways of doing old things. So, and I think I just got a message, hold on. Oops, let me see that. Yep, watching it. Okay, thank you. Okay, and now I'm just trying to get rid of that window, sorry. Navigation as a new way of doing things. Hold on. And, okay, there's a newspaper stand where you're not allowed to go in, where you have to go to the table, ask for what you want. There's no perusing, there's no browsing, there's a physical barrier. To the right, there's an area where you wait in chairs for when your food comes out at a takeout restaurant, properly spaced 6 feet apart, and also with affirmations about how you should be feeling in this crisis. Oops, give me 1 second. Okay. Other things here, certainly perception and action. There are many more steps to be doing these particular activities. Here's an elevator notice. You would think taking an elevator is a quite simple act, but in this case, you have to limit the number of people in the elevator to stop the spread. Not only should you not touch the button, you should use your elbow and never use your foot. So there are these new rules of activity that are really important. This is the Union Square Farmers Market, where a very, very tactile experience is now telling you, do not touch the products, we will serve you. Do not smell the produce, do not touch the produce, do not feel, do not press, do not squeeze, because proximity equals danger. Okay. Certainly another question is, how do we decide what to do and how to do it? No more than this number of people in this particular store. Please line up this way. We are open, we are closed. Maintain 6 feet distance. No mask, no enter, cash only or credit only. No handshaking, but clinking glasses is acceptable, or the order to riot at a closed bar. So again, how do I interpret the new rules of this particular circumstance if I'm doing it right? What is the right way of doing it? Do I have a choice? Do I understand the new directions? Am I capable of doing it at all? Decisions are increasingly top-down, perhaps. New behaviors are often inhibitory. You're being told what you cannot do. And there's certainly quite a bit more time when we're not going out and working to ruminate on what ifs. Uh-oh, am I contaminated? Am I not contaminated? Because I only have a few minutes, I'm not going to go into depth here. I'm happy to discuss any of these concepts with anyone else, but these relate directly to issues of personal agency, environmental competence, environmental efficacy, as I've written about a fair amount, and environmental press. We need to consider the environmental load and behavioral constraint models, the relation to control, reactants, and Seligman's classic learned helplessness work. What happens when I don't feel secure in my actions? What if I feel insecure or nervous or wary about the experience, and how does that relate to stress, depression, anxiety? And certainly very important here is the decreased sense of agentiveness, diminished environmental competence, feeling less efficacious in regards to the negotiation of challenge space. And what about the evocative nature of affordances, the effect on affect, all of these things? I'm watching the time. Almost there. These are more rules. Again, even celebrating Palm Sunday, if you celebrate Christian holidays, you have to take a sanitized palm frond. In order to do that, you are handed them with tongs. The market rules. COVID-19 mitigation detaches us from our physical reality. Our newly implemented safety measures and the virus itself blunt our lived sensory experiences. So not only does getting coronavirus, one of the symptoms is not being able to smell, not being able to taste, our mitigation experiences also very much do that. Cyberspace may be an inadequate simulacrum, likely devoid of context cues. Lives are restrained, desires constrained, environmental range constricted, but there is hope. So what are people doing? We find people are doing very sensorily immersive activities. We hear about baking, and our parks are overrun. This is Washington Square Park. We see increasing density in city parks, a place to reconnect, a place to exercise or play, a place to escape. A glimpse of BC before Corona life, green spaces as restorative, a place for live music. Sorry, I'm just looking at the time here. A place for public entertainment, the potential for multisensory stimulation and novelty. Local destinations allow for the avoidance of public transportation, and in many ways, it's the only viable third space. Certainly, we could go back to Oldenburg, but many people think of the third space in the context of Starbucks because it was part of their branding. Home, work, and other. Where do you socialize if there's nowhere you're allowed to be? The bottom left is actually a robot cart that allows people who are over 65 to take free paper towels, okay? Finally, we're all adapting to the pandemic reality. We must consider the lived experience of a variety of people. The PPE adorned essential employee now serving soup behind plexiglass at the famous B&H Dairy. The entrepreneur selling face masks, alcohol, and cleaning supplies at a markup off of Union Square. The homeless now residing inside repurposed spaces, quite often in ATMs because many of the banks are closed. The renter, the owner, the visitor, the worker, the man, the woman, the child, the adult, the senior, the high-risk individual, and the wealthy and the struggling, because there's certainly a socioeconomic component here, and being able to shelter in place very much is a privilege. So with gratitude to all of you, thank you for this, and please, I'm happy to discuss these topics because there's something I find quite a bit interesting, but like everyone else, this is very much a work in progress. Okay, I think I got it close to the time. Okay, oh, now I see take your time. I saw it after. And I'm happy to go back to any slides if anything's confusing. I know there's a lot of information there. In particular, the relationship to theoretical models, which is something I've done a fair amount of work with. I've done a lot of work with agency and environmental control with populations with disabilities. So it's certainly something I find very interesting. And I think all of us have very similar takes on this. But I think, you know, just to pose to all of you, I took a few notes here in that what does COVID-19 and the pandemic deprive us of? And then in terms of activities that will enrich us and will bolster us emotionally, you know, what can we do? I think it's interesting. We could look to the positive psychology movement, certainly, and look about engagement in restorative environments and green spaces. We could look to humor. We could look towards social connection, movement. All of these things very much come into play with all three of our takes on this particular pandemic. Hopefully that wasn't too rushed. Felt like I was doing the marathon, like the runner on the panel. Oh, there's still people here. We didn't run them all off, so that's a good sign.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. What you've done has made me homesick for Manhattan. You know, as I mentioned to you before, I'd lived there for 10 years and 11 years actually, and just seeing the pictures just brought back such a wonderful sort of soul sort of experience of that. I remember when 9/11 occurred, you know, I was there before that happened, and then came back into New York, you know, to get us do some conferences, visit some friends and so forth after 9/11, and you could really tell, you know, the city had shifted on a collective environmental sort of attitudinal kind of place. It was very sad for me. You know, you could feel the resilience, but there was a kind of that cockiness that I love about Manhattan was sort of buffered a little bit or buffed. And so I'm wondering if your experience with COVID was similar, you know, and those, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. You know, it's a very interesting thing in particular, and the press has paid a fair amount of attention to the number of high income people who've cleared out of the city. And certainly not from a public health perspective, but from a residential experience, my neighbors who stayed here are lovely, many elderly people, many people who've lived here for a long time. There's quite a bit of community and helping. A lot of people have said they don't want to live in New York anymore. So some people suggest perhaps this has the potential for revitalization, but certainly even before this, there's been you know, that term bleaker, B-L-E-A-K-E-R, rather than bleaker, B-L-E-E-K-E-R, because the neighborhood has been decimated by the retail Armageddon, as many people call, because people can't afford to live and own small businesses that aren't connected to some giant multinational corporate monolith at this point. But there is certainly hope, I think. But what New York will be, or what any area will be after this, I think remains to be seen. And some of it, I think, is going to be linked to how long we're in our pause. Many other areas are releasing and relaxing restrictions for the population. New York City has not given really a date to do that yet. So we're still very much in stasis. So I am hopeful, as I think we can all be, because we're all breathing, certainly. And I always love that saying. But what that transformation is going to look like for the person and for the people afterwards. There's some very, very interesting stuff. And whether or not these surveillance technologies are going to be temporary, or the changes be temporary, and there is this from week to week to day, there are a lot of changes. Will I always have to buy my produce behind rope? I don't know. I hope not. I don't think so. But there, and like both of you, I do teach. I've been teaching from home, which has been certainly challenging. What is the nature of education? I think we're all very much in the same place. I think it's a great question. If you have an answer, let me know.
I've just appreciated, again, I think the three of us are talking about that very thing. That's why I like the word undecidable, and what you're talking about with environment, and Tomo's talking about education and teaching, and you know, is what I certainly can associate to with what seems to be a disaster. It also gives us something, and yet it can be both. You know, the distancing can be detrimental and life-saving. It can be taking something from us and clarifying. And like Tomo was saying, is that when you're pushed into something, I mean, there's something negative about that. But then once we're pushed into it, you know, we may find ourselves doing things that we never thought we would. It's like my son is, his specialty is, he's in his master's program. He's starting his master's program on human performance, and the whole idea of what pulls us it motivates us when we're pushed. A good coach pushes you to the place to where you didn't think you could get. And COVID does that. But it's one of those things, not that we are glad it happened, kind of thing. Well, I'm glad this happened. I'm not sure if anybody really would want to say that. But that it's happened, it certainly has pushed us into new realms. And I'm just appreciative of how they dovetailed off of each other.
Yeah. Good. Anyone else? I don't see any questions. No open questions. Oh, wait, we just got one. Let's see. Okay. Thank you, Nicholas. Is city administration actively inviting citizens into appropriating public spaces? That's a great question, and one very much of contention. Who makes the decisions? Who is in control? Certainly, feedback from the population has changed policing of certain behaviors. I was speaking to a police officer a few days ago. Early on, they were mandating and ticketing people without masks. But certain communities were more likely to say, I don't want to do that. And the police officers themselves didn't want to particularly engage. So they've backed off on that enforcement. But who are the players? Certainly we have a lot of Bill Gates, Mike Bloomberg, a lot of public-private entities, a lot of experts, a lot of people telling the city what to do. But I personally, I think the city administration is not actively inviting citizens enough. What does a park look like when there's social distancing? It's a very good question. And I don't think it's been resolved yet. I'm sure you look online, there are lots of pictures of drawing big circles. Certain activities are getting preferential treatment. You could run, but you can't sunbathe. You can, there are many things like this. You could bike, but you can't play soccer. So there's certainly a negotiation, and I think the public is speaking up loudly what they need, what they want, what will sustain them. But it's very much, again, a top-down rather than bottom. It's not truly participatory as I would advocate for, and I think many other people would advocate for who are in who are either urban geographers or environmental psychologists or anyone else who works with city planning. I hope that answered it. It's a great question. And if anyone else has anything to add. Tomo?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting how this discussion went also with, Todd's input as well. And it also made me think about, I need to kind of think back on this idea of like resistance too, because I kind of might have mentioned it a little bit too casual, because it's also very dangerous, because to some extent, yes, I would advocate for resistance, but at the same time, if it's something that then endangers other people, right? Because there is a lot of resistance in this country, but it's not exactly the type of resistance that I'm thinking of. It's sort of like, the resistance as far as, keeping everybody safe. And I don't think that's necessarily something that we should resist, but of course, the other implications of why did we get to this place, in the first place, right? And why is it so extensive, particularly in this country? So these are the things that we might have to really rethink. But yeah, so just like a few more thoughts on resistance that just came up.
Yeah, and I think resistance takes many forms. I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're talking about political resistance, but certainly if we look at affordances, or in particular if we look at environmental press, that certainly many geriatricians use and I've used in my work, it's that we talk about the tension between our capacity and what we could do in the physical environment. And that's a type of resistance as well. Is the world around me fighting against my intentions? So we have sort of cognitive resistance, we have political resistance, and I think that's very important because, certainly in the geriatric research, we know that a little bit of resistance is good and healthy. But resistance on many levels, I think, is very much appropriate here.
And I think what Tomo's also brought up is the whole dilemma of, resistance itself can both generate a sense of immunity socially, existentially, but also what about the resistance of insisting on opening up that could be contagious which is, I'm from Georgia, and so Georgia, Florida, other states have opened up and now have a resurgence and expansion of COVID positive cases. And so, you know, when, I guess the question for me, and as an open question, is what's the relation of resistance to collaboration? And are they opposed to one another? Can they facilitate a new way of being with at a distance? And the way I'm responding to this is saying we are a community, and that the freedom is the freedom to work with each other, and that our 6 to 8 feet apart from each other doesn't make us less than a community. It makes us collaborative, co-laboring. And so it's a very good kind of question to kind of wrestle with.
And that's an interesting sort of psychological transformation. We're working together, but parallel, as opposed to being separate. And I think that's a very, very interesting thing to consider. What is the nature of our relationship to everyone when we are separate? And I think it relates to all of our talks in a very significant way.
And I think also, Jen, your stuff on agency and environment as well. I mean, in terms of to what extent, and as an existentialist, of course, agency, you know, and freedom, you know, is very paramount to who one is and how one's becoming, you know. But what is the relationship to my freedom in relation to others' rights, like Tomo was talking about? It's an interesting kind of thing.
And individual well-being. There's quite a bit of literature in the architectural world that talks about giving people control over their environments. Even David Chapin's work, certainly very early on with psychiatric inpatients, giving them a little control over their environment and how that can have an ameliorative effect on mental well-being. So certainly we want to feel as if we have some control.
But we don't want to press our entitlement and die,
of course.
Kill somebody else, or those kind of things. So again, undecidable.
Are there any other comments or questions? I don't see any up there right now. Let's see. Hopefully we didn't bore everyone into silence. I don't think so, but.
Well, I don't see any other comments or questions, here's a couple comments coming up.
Nicholas, we're sorry, we don't want to keep you up.
Well, I really appreciated presenting with y'all. How long have each of us been in quarantine? Since, well, I had to self-quarantine, of course, when I thought I had initial COVID before I was tested, and put myself in quarantine early. My partner was also tested positive, so since early March. So it's been quite a while.
Yeah, I think for Jennifer and I think the stay-at-home order happened around March 11th. You know, we were like in the middle of school, and then sometime in the afternoon we get this announcement that, you know, after today everything will transition into remote learning until the end of the school year. So yeah, also probably sometime around mid-March.
Yeah, and we're on separate academic calendars. So I started teaching my students in person, then around, I want to say March, maybe second week in March. But again, depending on if you're high risk or not, where you live, there are degrees of quarantine. I don't go out often, but I take walks. I go grocery shopping. I shop for my neighbors who just celebrated their 50th anniversary in quarantine, which is a very unique experience, certainly. But Stacy, how long have you been in quarantine? Oh, maybe Maybe she's in quarantine from the computer. Oh, yeah. And that goes back to Tomo's discussion too. You know, what does quarantine look like? Are you working at home? Are you not working at home? Have you had to transform your home into a classroom for your students and classroom for your children? Do you have people you have to isolate from? Do you live in an area where you could take a car, or you have to take public transportation, which is a big mediating factor for, I know for me, I don't know, Todd, do you rely on public transportation?
Yes and no. And we have our own vehicle, but also I use the CTA, or the subway here in Chicago as well in terms of transport. Yeah.
Anything?
Hello. So if you want to just give a few last words or something to sum up or something, since also for me, Friday started 5 minutes ago, so.
We need to help you get to sleep and get some rest. I know from my own self, I just want to thank you for helping kind of help us along here, and really appreciate knowing you're there to help facilitate this. And I've really enjoyed presenting with Jen and Tomo, and wish everyone the best of luck. And thanks to all the participants who have taken their time to sit in with us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you to everyone, the organizers, and so great to see the participants, even though I know for many of you it's the middle of the night.
Thank you. So it's 12 a.m. So the conversation can gladly continue on Slack. And thank you for a great panel. And have a great afternoon to you. And I'll be going to bed then.
Ja, schlafen Sie gut.
Dankeschön. Bye bye.
We'll see you. Bye bye.